All right, let's begin. Very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ed Fisher from 4C Labs, and I'm your host for today's session, The Future of Medical Cannabis Cultivation. Before we get into the subject matter and format of today's session, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to today's very esteemed panel. First up, we have Gary Yates. Gary, if you'd like to lift up your hand so everyone knows who you are. Gary is the Chief Scientific Officer of Pharmaseeds and is one of the UK's leading cannabis geneticists and plant scientists. Next up, we have Christopher Tasker. Hi, Chris. Chris holds a master's degree in cannabinoid research, is the author of several cannabis-oriented books, including the Canna Manual, and is the founder and CEO of Global Cannabinoid Solutions. Next up, we have Jamila Lamolfa Donaldson. Jamila is the founder of Pro Hempotic and a PhD student developing testing, cultivation, and processing methods of industrial hemp for therapeutic compounds. And then we get to Shanna Marinan. Dr. Shanna Marinan is a colleague and a peer of mine. She's a clinical research director at 4C Labs. She specializes in medical cannabis and psychedelics. Shanna is also vice chair of the Cannabis Industry Council in the UK for the research group specifically, and has also worked at the Psychoactive Substances Research Unit at the University of Hertfordshire. Next, we get on to our guest from abroad, Mark Levin-Marken. Mark is based in Cape Town, South Africa, but has worked internationally as a cultivation consultant. He's also designed and overseen the implementation of several medical cannabis facilities. He's advised various governments on cannabis policies. He's a GMP auditor. And finally, he's the director of Afghan Tissue Culture Laboratories. And last, but certainly not least, is John Matcham. John is the Innovation Director of Light Science Technologies, part of a publicly listed company, and is making waves in cutting-edge lighting solutions for the medical cannabis sector. It's probably safe to say that John is one of the world's leading experts on lighting science for agricultural solutions. So today's session is divided into 7 parts. I'm going to take a moment now and post the agenda into the chat to save a bit of time. You'll notice that the final 2 sections are slightly technical, and that's because we're looking to appeal to a broad audience today. We have both medical cannabis patients, physicians, as well as people from the industry, including cultivators on today's call. Finally, we'll wrap up with a Q&A session where you as a participant can take any burning question that you have and pop it into the chat. And we'll do our best to try and get around to all of those questions in the final 30 minutes of the webinar. So without further ado, let's hop straight in. Our first section is called Blast from the Past. Why are we cultivating again? So at the moment, there are hundreds of cannabis cultivation facilities popping up all over the globe. Europe, Africa, the Americas, Canada, Asia, Australia. And I guess my question for today's panelists is, what changed? Why are we cultivating cannabis for medical purposes again at such a large scale? And what I'm going to do is hand over to Chris to begin the dialogue on this particular topic. We're going to try and keep this section to about 10 minutes. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you for putting such a lovely panel of incredibly knowledgeable people together as well. Top work. So a little context for everyone. I think I'll start off with a few sort of notes and numbers just to give people context to all of this cannabis conversation that we're having, and maybe from there that'll set the scene nicely and lead into a bit more of a discussion about the finer details. So at the moment, and in the last few years, the UK has been one of the largest producers of cannabis. In 2016, the UK produced 95 tons of cannabis, which was all exported internationally. And then in 2019, we produced 320 tons of cannabis. And that's as of the UN Narcotics Control Board, where they basically tot up all the drugs around the world and what's going on. And most of that production has been done privately by British Sugar, GW Cannabis, and the organizations behind that. So large amounts of cannabis already being produced, and that's under license. In the unlicensed market, which is maybe I'll try and use that term to sort of segregate the two. We've got about £3 billion worth of cannabis moving through what is essentially the black market at the moment, and that's where the majority of the British public sourcing their cannabis from at the moment. Now, why are they doing that? That's where the sort of research has led into. And so what we found is that there's obviously these wonderful therapeutic compounds in cannabis, which have a unique interaction with human bodies, human health. And so basically, since prohibition and the sort of lockdown almost of drugs and the clamp down on access to drugs, we've almost lost the research and science and knowledge in those areas of drugs and human health, essentially. And we're now almost rediscovering that, reopening that Pandora's box almost of drug research information. Drug science has done a wonderful job, but it's been under tremendous strain. So what we're seeing is that human bodies also produce cannabinoids endogenously. And so the reason we're producing all this cannabis is it seems to be working on human endocannabinoid systems and providing a new option of therapeutics and a new generation of treatments that we can basically extract from cannabis and put into humans. And so thus the big cannabis rush at the moment, and that's why everyone's looking at cultivation. But the question then becomes, okay, if we're cultivating all this cannabis, why is it still illegal? And so we've got now the question around, well, how are we going to regulate this? How are we going to make sure it's fair? And also look at, is there maybe better ways that we can regulate now that we're learning more about cannabis, its safety, how it can be produced large scale, small scale, and at a community level. And so I guess we'll touch on a few of those nuances as we go through with different speakers over the next hour or so. But essentially, 1.4 million people are estimated to be relying on cannabis in some way, shape, or form. And at the moment, a very small portion of those have access to this legal cannabis. And so there's been a boost in production and design for facilities, general cultivation, investment. And so a lot of that cannabis is already being produced, and how do we sort of merge all those worlds together? And so I guess we'll pick through some of that with all the lovely people here. Obviously, we've also got industrial hemp and all of the industrial applications, notwithstanding the health side of things. So I'll cut my intro there, but I hope that set the scene and hopefully started off a few good points for people to latch onto and fill in the cracks of. But yeah. See Gary's hands up there.
Gary's hands up. Yeah. Indeed.
Chris, I was just going to ask then.
Sorry, go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, do you think that new information about the endocannabinoid system itself, which is fairly new in terms of science, and now the interaction from the cannabinoids in the plant, do you think that now that we've got science behind that, do you think that's what spurred this new wave, this new renewed interest in cannabis cultivation? Do you think that's part of it? Is that what you were saying?
Sort of. I know when you speak to a lot of cannabis companies, ultimately a lot of them would love to be in the recreational market, but obviously that's not quite a conversation yet. But at a sort of biological medical research level, there's so much that we can be doing to convert crude cannabis use into refined medical practices and actual therapeutic strategies. And so cannabis is very much like carpet bombing the endocannabinoid system and hoping for the best at the moment, which is pretty safe, but also not very advanced. And so how can we move that towards more modernized techniques where we're integrating all this lovely technology we've got so that we can actually make more refined treatments, more refined medicines that aren't as dirty in the body and don't have as broad off-site sort of unwanted adverse effects. So I think it's more popularity in marketing as to why a lot of cultivation is springing up, because a lot of it's already being produced already. Most people produce at home in the UK, if they are, and historically, up until a few years ago, once the law changed, there was a lot of community-based cannabis cultivation, mum and dad, auntie and uncles, nephews and nieces. So all of that's still out there, and that's the biggest market at the moment. But I guess the question becomes, how do you commercialize all this information? How do you industrialize it? How do you make it safer? and how do you make it a fair industry and a fair sort of market. So there's a lot of refining to be done, but that's, I guess, the fundamental elements and fingerprints that need to be sort of intertwined and overlapped and built on, essentially. So yeah, I hope that answers the question a bit, Gary.
Yeah, very, very interesting, and some great points there. I guess my question is, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, and I'm going to send this one to Mark. Sorry to throw you under the bus, Mark. But Mark, do you believe that sort of the interest in cannabis is indicative of the fact that there's just hype around the fact that it's a new sector? Or do you believe, and I guess this is something that Shanna and Jamila can also contribute towards, or do you believe that, like, from a medical perspective, and that the research that's being done and its findings are actually justified? So what I'm saying is all of the hype backed by science, or is it more sort of indicative of the fact that it's a fresh sector and cannabis has always kind of had a place culturally in most sort of cultures around the world?
I would say most certainly the fact that cannabis has been, predates human existence. It's very much part of our medical treatments. There's been a hiatus, since Prohibition, but before that, cannabis was most certainly a big part of the physician's toolkit and his bag of tricks. Cannabis made up 50% of all medicines. So, I think what's really driving it is the fact that there are some huge class action lawsuits in the States where analgesics are actually being successfully won. And now we have a solution where it is basically hardly contraindicated with any other drugs and is showing very strong signs of promise to be not a silver bullet, but a better solution than we have right now. If it was if cannabis was discovered tomorrow, it would be hailed as a miracle cure.
I actually saw that the Surgeon General of the US said exactly that if you could remove all of the cultural and political baggage from cannabis, it would probably be regarded as a wonder drug. I mean, not that it's without harm for some people. Shanna, where do you kind of sit here? Do you think that, the science is very much in its infancy? Or do you think that there is enough evidence now for us to be genuinely excited about the therapeutic potential of cannabis?
I think there is very strong evidence for certain indications, and there's very exciting emerging evidence for many others. And it is such a wide range of conditions. And one of the issues is that while we have lots and lots of evidence, it isn't necessarily the RTCs that regulators like to see. And I'm going to be talking about more of that in my section. But yeah, I absolutely think that there's enough evidence there for us to be very excited about.
Okay. Jamila, any thoughts that you want to contribute? Oh, I think we've lost your audio. There we go.
No, yeah, absolutely. I could probably echo what everyone else has said, but in my personal experience, my PhD has been part funded by the taxpayers, and some of it funded by an industrial partner who I presume has seen the kind of, in the modern context, the rise of CBD and wellness products, and has seen a business opportunity for domestic cultivation of cannabis and then processing of it in the UK. And so my PhD started in 2018, and it was the first time that we've had any cannabis grown on campus or in our labs. And so it's very much being spurred by popular demand and this growing industry. But then, of course, there is an interest from research to present the data and the science to back up a lot of the claims. And so that's what we're beginning to see. We're very much seeing a resurgence of cannabis in research from a scientific point of view. And so I'm very honored to join the likes of Christopher Tasker and Gary Yates, who are some of the first researchers and academics here in the UK in the space. So yeah, there's definitely a lot more coming.
Thank you. So, I mean, it seems like what I'm hearing is that there's this qualitative evidence for medical cannabis throughout our history, as Mark mentioned. There's a renewed interest in the scientific community for a range of conditions. we haven't really touched on what those conditions are, which we can in a moment. And then, sort of there is the fact that there's almost a bit of a renaissance going on, but we're not quite there yet in terms of having the evidence that we need through, for example, clinical trials, which we'll talk about shortly, which would get the wider medical sort of community to buy into cannabis. What is it about the cannabis plant that makes it so interesting from a therapeutic perspective? I mean, we hear about things like cannabinoids. We also hear about things like terpenes. What are the role of these particular chemicals? How do they actually work? And do terpenes actually have sort of medical properties, or are they just sort of, essential oils that, add to the plant's smell and flavor? So I'd be interested to kind of hear some of the perspectives from the group on those subjects, because we also always talk about THC and CBD, THC being the psychoactive substance, CBD, sort of not being psychoactive, but having medical properties. Why is the biochemistry of the cannabis plant so interesting, is my question. I don't know if, Gary, you want to maybe step in here at all, because I know that you know a fair amount about cannabis genetics and cannabinoids.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to get a handle on it, because I think one of the problems is the way that this works, as if you look at it as a pharmaceutical, the way it works as a drug is not really that clear cut. It's not really lock and key. Okay, it does this one thing, boom, let's go. And that's wherein lies the problem, that the systems for measurement have been built around this lock and key system, but this is probably a multifactorial system where you may even have things like terpenes or they effect on their own, but they may be modulating the effects of other things, or maybe some synergy throughout the interactions that way that we are yet to get to, because we're still looking for individual molecules doing specific things. So this plant is throwing like an absolute, an array, a ridiculous amount of chemicals that is. I mean, cannabinoids, terpenoids, and flavonoids alone takes you well over 400 compounds that we've discovered. So that, and we're just scratching the surface at THC and CBD and a few others. There's a long way to go. And yeah, I think we need to start reconsidering how we measure these things in order to get the best, information out of how effective it is as a medicine.
It sounds like what I'm hearing is, in a way, cannabis kind of breaks the traditional pharmaceutical model, because it isn't just an isolated compound. You're producing a plant, you're cultivating something that's incredibly complex, and it has all of these synergistic and entourage effects that makes kind of the standard experimentation result model almost kind of superfluous. I mean, one of the things is that, there've been quite senior politicians in the UK, and we're moving into the cannabis on trial section now. And also people in the medical community, like the MHRA, that have said, okay, we acknowledge the fact that cannabis has these medical properties, but if you want to see cannabis prescribed more widely in the UK, you have to invest in clinical trials. And that would, in turn also grow local cultivation, because as sort of Chris alluded to earlier, we're producing a massive amount of cannabis that's being exported in the licensed space for two products that have essentially gone through clinical trials. And you can see the effect that that's had on the volume that the UK is exporting. But as a plant, without refining it down to single cannabinoids, if you look at the benefits of the whole complex plant, I really struggled to see how that could fit in with the traditional clinical trial model. So my question is this: is it realistic to expect a fledgling industry with a product that has relatively low toxicity for most people to invest tens of millions or hundreds of millions into clinical trials? Are these realistic demands? And could we actually get cannabis to even fit into a clinical trial framework? I think I'm going to hand over to you, Shanna, to take this one away.
Sure. So I think I'll start by describing the process for new pharmaceuticals generally, and then we can see why that might not be the best fit for cannabis. So generally, it's a very standardized development and testing process, which starts with early drug discovery, where you identify molecules of interest, and then a very tiny minority of these are taken forward to preclinical research, which is all lab-based. And then you've got the clinical research stage, where participants and patients come in, and this is where the drug is actually trialed in humans. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in a second. And then following that, you've got regulatory approval, pending successful results. So this process can take over a decade. It can cost millions, if not billions. And it's generally a pretty good process. And these randomized controlled trials, the RCTs that form the clinical research part of that, are considered the gold standard in research, but they're not necessarily a good fit for medical cannabis because they're designed to cater to a single molecule, which is highly replicable, which is highly consistent, and which can be given in a very, you've got a tight protocol where a specific dose is given, a specific points of interval points, and it doesn't work with medical cannabis, where it's much more personalized prescribing. It's almost an art form to decide what formulations and ratios somebody should receive, what strength, and how they should take that. So what can we do instead? Well, we could look to real world evidence. So there are other data collection methodologies that we can use. Unfortunately, regulatory bodies don't tend to look upon these very favorably, and it's not, it's a shame because they provide very, very rich data. So for example, we can start prescribing medical cannabis to patients where there is a strong indication that this might be successful. So we've got a range of different conditions where we know it's showing great promise, and monitor how those patients are doing. So these are patient registries, and they're kind of more observational trial designs. So something like the 2021 trial by Drug Science, for example, which accepts such a broader range of patients as well than a clinical trial typically would. So randomized control trials, they tend to select the very perfect patients, the ones who just have one condition, and they're within a certain band of ages, and they haven't got any, they're not on lots of different medications, and it's almost not very realistic of the patients that you encounter in the real world. So by using real world evidence, we can be more inclusive, we can monitor for a longer period of time, it's much less expensive to do, and we can just get a much richer picture of data. So as well as looking at the symptoms of the condition in question and whether those are improving and whether the patient's experiencing any side effects, we can also see, are they sleeping better, are they exercising more, how are their personal relationships, how is their mood, just lots and lots and lots more things can be looked at. So in my opinion, it's a superior form of data, and we need to just work on getting it recognized.
What about from the rest of the panel? Does anybody else have sentiments on this? Does anybody feel quite strongly about the fact that, cannabis shouldn't have to go through clinical trials given its length of use and, as we said previously, for the majority of the population, relatively low toxicity?
I think Jamila had one. She's got a golden hand up there.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw another idea in the mix and wanted to get your feedback on it, Shanna, because what would you say to a patient or a cannabis user, and they have self-treated themselves? They've probably been diagnosed, whether that's been through their GP or their health practitioners, but they've self-treated themselves using cannabis for, however long. What advice would you give to someone like that who has, quote unquote, cured their condition and wants to get this information out to the right people? What do you think of, for example, case studies? Do you know if there is a route to publishing that kind of data, and how, and if there are any other means that we can collate this data directly from patients in order to add that into the conversation and the evidence for medical cannabis use?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a wealth of data out there which currently gets missed as well, because it is people's own personal stories, and exactly there's this gap in how do people get to communicate that and legitimize their experiences in that way. I do think Drug Science is doing some more work around this, collecting interesting case reports, and we'll be publishing those so people can get in touch there. I can help connect people to the right people if they'd like that as well. And this real world evidence, because this can consist of things like GP records as well. So it's not just we're not just talking here about new forms of trial design where people can even be using wearable tech and so on to monitor all of their their functioning during that time. But it could also be looking at GP records and seeing how people improve over time once, if they have self-declared that they're using medical cannabis or because they've received a prescription. Like, there's lots of different ways we could do this, but it's just about approaching it with an open mind and thinking about the wealth of data that is out there and how that can best be utilized in new ways.
Very interesting. Chris.
Very beautiful points there, Jamila and Shanna. I think also on a flip side to this, we're also almost in danger of like over medicalizing cannabis. Like, fair enough if we want to make refined medicines out of cannabis, but do we necessarily need to regulate everything about the cannabis plant, every interaction, every prescription of it? Not necessarily. And on the point that Shanna made there, like self-diagnosis, and I think it might have been Jamila actually that made the self-diagnosis point. I think most humans are capable of diagnosing themselves and seeing if something works for them or not. And if it, the next part is, do we need to criminalize people that are choosing to do that as well? Which is, I think, a big overlooked factor in our industry is 99% of the population are still criminalized for using cannabis and making their own independent decisions around cannabis, which is that making them safer, or is that endangering them more? I'd probably argue endangering them more. And could we make them safer by educating those people rather than criminalizing those people too? I think so as well. And when we're having a medical discussion around cannabis, it's easy to just look down the lens of medicine and say, well, how do we cram this into the medical system? It's a plant at the end of the day. So I think we can overthink these things too and over-regulate and go down rabbit holes of regulation where they're just not really practical anymore. So I think what would make sense would just be people can cultivate themselves, give it a go. But if they actually want to go down a medical grade, medical product, medically assisted route, that refined option's there. But if you just want to do it at home, give it a go. You're not going to die. It's very hard to. And if you're putting those educational and safety mechanisms in place, that would probably mitigate a lot of the risk as well. And just knowing that don't mix it with tobacco, don't smoke it with bleach white papers, vaporize it, find ways of doing it slightly more sustainably. Bit anarchic potentially, but at the same time, do we need to regulate every adult's interaction?
Fair points, Chris. I see that your point has elicited quite a furore of interest. So we've got John, Shanna, and Gary, and we're going to move across to you now. We've probably got about another 3 minutes on this section. Before I move across to those three panelists, something that's coming through quite strongly is, and this is where the dots connect, by the way, you might be saying, well, what do clinical trials have to do with cannabis cultivation? Because ultimately the route that things end up going depends on whether we end up with a distributed system of cultivation where it's decriminalized and people cultivate at home, or essentially, there is this large pharmaceutical sort of model with massive glass houses where biomass is cultivated and then extracted and turned into medicines. So it is highly relevant to the way things develop from a cultivation perspective. But I'd be really interested to see what some of the other panelists think about that point. John, do you want to kick off with what you were going to say? And if you could each try and keep it to 1 minute, your response moving forward from here, please, guys. Thank you.
I'm probably the least qualified to comment on the medicinal value of.
That's why you should.
And that's probably why I'm going. And when we got involved in this a little while ago, one of the things I wanted to do was to discover more about it and completely understand it as much as I could. And I got involved, and I actually went and took the prescription course. So I'm actually qualified to prescribe, even though I'm not allowed to, because clearly I'm not a GP. And that was a very interesting passage to convince investors and people like that behind me that we were entering into a market that was something really very sensible to do. And there is this sort of grey area where we don't have that information out in the common day-to-day world of where cannabis comes from, how it's used. And I think both sides of the story have a value. I do think, though, in what is, I think, described earlier on as either the leisure or the self-prescribing side, there should be a certain amount of research done to help people understand how to use it. I think it's a bit too easy to say, go and experiment and everything else. As an innovator and somebody who experiments all the time, health and safety comes in all as a question. And you have to think, if you gave somebody who was the wrong age or the wrong amount or something, and went the balance between THC and CBDs and so forth. I wonder if that was something that needs to be sort of thought about.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, very interesting point. Shall we move across to Shanna? Shanna, would you like to say something?
Sure, thank you. So all I wanted to say is that although we know that there's around 1 million or more people who are self-medicating in the UK at present with medical cannabis, there are lots of people who never would. So people who have MS, people who are undergoing chemotherapy, who could respond very, very well to medical cannabis, but they're never going to grow it themselves. And they're not even going to go and see, you know, let's say a street dealer. So, you know, I absolutely support decriminalisation, and I've got nothing but gratitude and admiration for all the legacy growers that have supported this 1 million plus people up until now. But we have to legislate to break down the barriers and be inclusive to everybody, and really bring this medicine to the majority of people that it could benefit. So yeah, I do.
Excellent point. No, very good point. So the fact that many people might not be aware that, you know, the microbial content or bacteria that is found on cannabis flower, even in a relatively hygienic home grow, could be potentially fatal to somebody with a compromised immune system if they were to inhale that into their lungs. And, you know, while the medical sector, you know, is incredibly stringent, one of the things that it does enforce, even maybe perhaps to the detriment of the final product, is sterilization. So there are these controls in place which protect the most vulnerable patients. So I completely agree. I think that there is a side for you know, there's a case for both sides, really. But thanks, really interesting conversation.
Could I wrap that a little bit up, Ed? Last one, 30 seconds.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
No, I should clarify my point as well for people that don't know me as well. Like, I think there's a medium between both that should be there, and like a nice balance. I think there's a lot of either or, and it's got to be our way or the highway. But I've got a little analogy here that I hear getting thrown around quite a lot. There's a nice people can grow nice homegrown tomatoes, but there can still be a thriving tomato ketchup industry, for example. It doesn't necessarily need to be all or nothing or at all costs. And particularly with, say, cancers and things like that, where the tumor, even the tumor is unique in its endocannabinoid system from healthy tissue, there's a whole new level of next generation personalized medicines that are going to materialize at some point. And prescribing cannabis is very much the lowest, it's the low hanging fruit at the moment. So as over the timeline of this progression in terms of research and products that are available, it's going to materialize to a point where there are like custom cannabinoid treatments for each person's cancer, for example, rather than, say, a magic bud that's going to cure that cancer and save the healthy tissue as well. So there's a lot of nuances there that I just wanted to pop in at the end. So
no, great point. Thanks, Chris. No, that's excellent. So let's move on to the next section then. How does one become a legal cultivator of medical cannabis under the current UK regulations? So, I mean, when cultivating for the medical market, the regulations and requirements mean that cannabis cultivators and processors essentially have to meet the demands of the pharmaceutical industry, no different to as if they were producing any other medicine. These regulations in the EU and UK are much stricter than other jurisdictions, like most of the state-based models in the US, for example. Many might not be familiar with the fact that medical cannabis cultivation and processing falls under two different sets of regulations. One is GACP, or Good Agricultural Collection Practices, which relates to the grow itself. And then the minute those plants are chopped down, they have to move into a good pharmaceutical manufacturing process environment, or GMP. GMP is particularly complex. I know this firsthand. Once plants are harvested, they enter into this pharmaceutical environment. What are some of the complexities of these regulations for cannabis cultivators? And as a result, their final products that they produce and are prescribed to patients. I'm going to ask Mark to take this one away, seeing that you've designed several facilities and you're very familiar with GMP.
Ed, I think it's important for us to understand the main concepts. And at a high level, the regulator would be licensing a facility, but on top of that facility exists something called the quality management system. And the quality management system is the umbrella that licensing facility would be licensed under. So we look at what makes up that quality management system. The quality management system is made up of a whole bunch of standard operating procedures for that cannabis facility. Number one, and there can be, depending on if you doing the final production of the dosage form, packaged dosage form, you could have up to 250 standard operating procedures. Aligned with those standard operating procedures would be your master files, and those are your various divisions within the facility. So that would be your cultivation master plan, your security master plan, and your facility master, site master plan. You mentioned earlier the aspect of GMP. What is GMP? Quite simply, it's not a set of rules, it's a set of guidelines that basically suggest ways of managing people, procedures, paper, and policies within that organization. Good manufacturing practice is what it stands for. You might have heard people mentioning things like get more paper, because I mean, there is an SOP on SOPs for the cannabis facility. And these are all the most important things that the regulator will be examining and looking at, not just the facility.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm getting an anxiety attack just listening to you, Mark. It's throwing me back to when we had to do the licensing for our facility.
Yes.
And I think we probably had over 1,000 pages by the time we filed our application. So it makes sense. I mean, to give you a practical example of what Mark's talking about, you might say, how do you make a cup of tea? And your first thing would be like, well, take the milk out of the fridge and put it on the counter. And that might be a standard operating procedure. But in GMP, you have to know the name of the cow, where the cow lived, how the cow was treated, what the cow was fed, and how that milk was transported to the store, what conditions it was stored under, who handled it. And then it has to be measured out very precisely in a container, which you have to apply all of the same logic to. So by the time you've done, sort of particularly what I've found is that, sort of if you're looking to become a cultivator outside of what you spend on your facility, you're probably going to spend close to £1 million just on compliance and paperwork to be able to be in a position where you could actually have that quality management system. And I guess, we want to protect patients, but also at the same time, is this overkill or is it a necessary evil? What are some of the thoughts of the people on the call today?
Well, Ed, if I can just continue on that. The whole concept of having a harmonized GMP framework means that if I'm producing medicine in South Africa, that it would be acceptable to the regulators in the UK. That's why we have it, to ensure that the patient can get consistent, predictable, reliable quality every time that his prescription is fulfilled. This gets back to the question that we had before this module, which is quite important to say that we have taken a plant and we've now put it under the pharmaceutical regulatory framework, and that's just what we have to comply with. And I want to know that the medicine that I'm having is not full of pesticides and residual solvents and heavy metals and things that I don't want in my body. And in testing black market products, it's surprisingly high, where some really nasty pesticides are actually in black market products.
I've heard that.
Yeah. So it's just really important to make sure that we have products that are clean and safe. I think the broad question I'd like to put to the audience as well, in case anyone is really actively pursuing this as a business proposition and they would like to invest, and you asked, how do you get a legal facility going? As a word of advice for anybody that is considering it, is start backwards. what is the final product that you would like to create in that facility? Is it going to be something for an API, an active pharmaceutical ingredient, where you'll just be growing inflorescence for extraction? Are you going to be packaging final dosage forms? Are you just going to be exporting flower? What is it that you're going to do? And once you've answered those questions, then talk about the jurisdiction that you would like to be going to. As we know, Germany is a great market because you can get top money per gram for your product, but the levels of compliance are exceptionally high. There are a lot of hoops to jump through. They're worth jumping through because once you have ticked all the boxes, it's almost like attaching a speedboat to an oil tanker. You know, the industry just moves with you, which is great for manufacturers and gives them surety of income and offtake for the future. But it's very important to actually identify which product you will be creating and then build your facility backward from there, because the price and the investment can vary enormously, all the way from something that would be 10 or 15 million pounds down to something that might be 2 million pounds. And
that
makes
absolute sense.
And make sure you get expert advice and consultants that have deep levels and breadth of experience to ensure that your investment is used wisely.
We've certainly seen that in the Channel Islands, Mark, where a number of cultivators were told that they could cultivate cannabis and there would be an offtake agreement for their product, and people sort of rushed ahead, but then realized that they actually hadn't met the regulatory standards and their product had to be destroyed, which is quite sad because people invest quite a lot of their livelihood in getting these grows off the ground. So that's a cautionary tale that's worth bearing in mind. So there's the GMP component, which would relate to the MHRA, or Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Authority. You would have to satisfy that as part of your quality management system. But then there's also the security side, which relates to the Home Office. I think security in and of its own right is quite a big project. Why is the security element of such a massive concern? And kind of, how do you mitigate some of those risks?
With very, very careful planning. So I've designed facilities around the world, and a number in South Africa. Right now, just to use it as an example, we have about 24 licensed facilities in cultivation right now, and another 300 being built. Now, in South Africa, people who farm avocados regularly have their crops stolen. But if you take into account that the value of a cannabis plant at harvest, when it's ready to be harvested, is worth in pound terms £1,000. And when you've got 5 hectares of it, you've got millions and millions of dollars worth of plants. So just from a risk mitigation point of view for the staff that work there, it's hugely important to have the security in place. Number 2, to ensure that the product doesn't get into the hands of the black market and perpetuates a secondary industry which supports criminals. Makes sense.
I wonder if some of these things have knock-on effects on the actual product quality, because you're probably spending so much time just trying to be compliant and staying secure that almost kind of growing sometimes becomes ancillary. Here's a question to the group, just by a show of hands. How many of you have either been prescribed medical cannabis, or at least seen what prescribed medical cannabis looks like in the UK? If you want to just raise your hands. Okay. Do any of you think that it matches and I use the term broadly, the quality of what is available on the illicit market? So let's just quickly go around quickly. Shanna, would you say that the medical products, particularly flower, match what is available in the illicit market in the UK?
I think it's really an emerging sector, and I think it will get better. I think currently it
That's
depends.
Very kind of you.
But it also depends on what your heritage grower is producing, because I don't like to call it the black market, but let's say like the the non-medical market.
Let's call it the non-medical market.
Yeah,
I think that's fairer. Yeah.
The quality can vary so broadly there that it really just, it's like just comparing the two very entities there. But absolutely, I mean, there's people who've dedicated their lives to it. There's heritage growers that have been doing this for decades, and they're very, very proud of their work, and they're very well respected for it, and within that sector. And it would be really, really difficult to compete with them at the moment, and given all of these compliance considerations that you've talked about, I do
sterilization and so on, which affects the makeup of the plant.
It's going to take up the majority of people's attention at this stage, but I think there's an opportunity to work together, and I'd like to see some of this expertise from the heritage market being brought in to the medical model and utilised, because why wouldn't you? There's people who really know their stuff there. And
absolutely, as I remember Gary saying, and I guess this is probably a segue into his section in a moment, but the medical market and its genetics in many respects are completely and utterly sort of indebted to legacy growers, because without legacy growers there wouldn't be those genetics. So a great point. Right, let's move on to our next section, because we're running out of time. So I just want to make sure that we get through sort of the key sections. Is there a future for medical cannabis cultivation in the UK? I mean, given the fact that you've got, for indoor grows, which are very power hungry, a massive cost of electricity, which has gone up exponentially and is the highest in Europe at the moment, which kind of like throttles the sector there a bit. Then you've got a climate that can maybe make outdoor growing tricky. And then, sort of a set of regulations, not to mention patient expectations. That means growing medical cannabis flower as a finished product outdoors is probably not advisable, because people sort of are used to, I guess, indoor cannabis flower. If they're migrating across from, we're not going to use the black market, shall we say legacy market? Yeah, that's the one. And then finally, the massive capital cost of setup and the years of work before you can even sell products. Jamila, do you think that the UK is a favorable jurisdiction for cannabis cultivation?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important question, and you've already highlighted a lot of the nuances around cultivation that have to be considered beforehand. I think that there is a future. I think there is a challenge that I think that can be taken on by various, but it requires collaboration between various different expertise and sectors, and more importantly, it has to be centered around patients and what patients need. So just to allude back to the question you asked before around the current quality of medical cannabis that is cultivated, or that is available here on the market, I've been absolutely terrified by some of the quality.
Have we lost Jamila?
Quality of cannabis, rather the safety, whether that's been imported or been, can you hear me now?
You're back,
yeah. I was just commenting on the poor safety of some of the medical cannabis that's been available on the market. I've been deep.
Oh, I think we may have lost you again, Jamila.
Concerned by patients, the mold and the small. I'm so sorry.
No, don't worry. I think what we heard that you were saying is that basically there've been some product issues in the UK with medical cannabis products. Like, for example, I know that earlier this year there were some products that were found to have white powdery mildew in, which really should not be the case, given the fact that there are these incredibly strict standards. Is that fair?
That's exactly my point. So it's very important that everything that is done for medical cannabis cultivation, it's with the patient's interests in mind and their utmost safety. With that being said, though, I don't think it's a clear cut between indoor and outdoor. Outdoor cultivation is not necessarily unsafe or unsanitary. I think that we can actually give the cannabis plant a lot more credit than it's due. The very fact that it produces these compounds in such abundance show how much it works to protect itself from pathogens and other threats to its, existence. And however, of course, there are benefits to growing indoors in a more controlled environment. And so there's definitely a conversation that needs to be had. I think it'd be really interesting if people could comment and share with us what they would prefer. Would they prefer to have cannabis cultivated indoors or outdoors? I think it may be a preference as well. I think patients are allowed to have a preference and have that opportunity to decide. But of course, yes, there are many different challenges that have to be overcome. However, I think what's going to be key in doing so is having rigorous data and testing. I think there needs to be a marriage between cultivation and testing. So when we're talking about a plant of any biological entity which is not homogeneous in any kind of sense in the plant itself, how it changes throughout its growth, testing is going to be integral to getting the data that we need. I think it's more about providing that data instead of pigeonholing cannabis and trying to shove it into a circle peg into a square hole. And instead, what we need is transparency that can be afforded by data that tracks every aspect of the cultivation process and processing and beyond, so that patients have the.
Oh, I think we're losing you again, Jamila. I'll just pop in here.
And also prescribers as well have the information about. It's very bad reception at the moment. Yeah.
No, don't worry.
Yeah.
I definitely get the gist of it, and I think you're right. I mean, like, sort of testing is such a fundamental component in terms of the cultivation life cycle. I also think that it's not that binary. You get sort of light assist glass houses where you're yielding the power of the sun when it is available. And given the summer that we had sort of this year, you quite rightly say that the UK is an excellent environment for cannabis cultivation. And light assisting technology in those greenhouses might make it relatively affordable to cultivate here. Chris, I think that you wanted to make a point slightly earlier. Am I right?
Yes, thank you, Ed. I'll just throw in a few more numbers that I thought would be useful, and it'd be interesting to get some of our fellow cultivators' perspectives as well on some of this. But there was a big paper that came out a few years ago, basically around, they quantified the environmental impact of cannabis production basically in large-scale facilities. I don't know how much more efficient they've become in the last year or two, but it was estimated that 1 kilo of indoor produced cannabis flower came at the expense of 3.5 tons of CO2 production to the external environment. Wow. So if we're talking about, well, there's tons being grown in the UK already, 320 tons approximately. Do we need more facilities growing more cannabis rather inefficiently? And going back to Jamila's point as well, does all of this warrant that marginal difference in product quality? I think it just seems like, I can't believe doctors are prescribing cannabis flower. That's the most baffling thing to me on the planet. Fair enough if it's going to be sort of standardized products, but cannabis flower is such an unstandardizable product. It's ridiculous. It changes, like, you could test it one day, the next day there'll be a completely different ratio of compounds in there. So we're talking about standardizing the unstandardizable, which is like insanity, really, I think. And so the job is, if we're going to talk about pharmaceutical cannabis and medical grade cannabis, we should be looking at using the full pharmaceutical model, turning it into products like GW. And I'll use quickly GW as an example of how it worked successfully. How it's worked successfully so far. So they've cultivated their cannabis for a purpose, which was to produce a clinical medicine. They've paid for the clinical trials of that, and they've come out with a licensed medicine in the form of Sativex and Epidiolex.
And they sold for £7 billion. So clearly it was in their interests and worthwhile.
It's been a 20-year process to get there. And there's a lot of companies thinking we'll set up a facility this week and next week we'll be selling pharmaceutical medical products. I think there's a balance of expectations and also a balance of, like Jamila said, why are we trying to pigeonhole everything? It's a plant with a million uses, so obviously there's going to be a million different interpretations of how you can implement it and utilize it. So I think we're in danger of over-regulating, and going back to the question around, oh, well, does pharmaceutical grade cannabis going through a clinic match the cannabis quality that people are expecting already? If it's not superior times 10, it seems pretty pointless to do. If it's minimally, marginally hit and miss, even through a clinic, it just seems a bit pointless to try and force flower through a non-functional system that doesn't really, it's not meant for botanical plants, it's meant for that have gone through the clinical trial process. So I think we're just trying to desperately box it wherever we can and just go, we'll just do this, just do that. But
absolutely.
And I'm forgetting whose point it was as well. We need more evidence in order to make those decisions that we're sort of preempting and jumping the gun on slightly. So yeah,
that's why we invited you, Chris, because your contrarian viewpoints, which I always find refreshing. Jamila, I'm conscious of the fact that you have to go quickly. So before we move across to the next section on unnatural selection and cannabis genetics, is there anything else that you want to add?
I was just gonna... I think. Go. Sorry, I took you to Jamila. Sorry, Jamila.
No. I'll hop across to you in a moment, John. No problem. I
look forward to hearing what John has to say, but just very quickly, just off the back what Chris just mentioned, I would like to pose to the panel how best our efforts should be placed. Is it increasing yield? Is it maintaining a reliable source of of growers of different products? And also, what do you think about the objective of growing particular cultivars for a specific condition? Is that worth doing? Are we there yet with the science? Or should we be, or GW Pharmaceuticals have taken an approach of let's have different strains where we have a dominant main cannabinoid and then put them through a clinical trial to see if it worked for a certain indication? Thank you so much.
Excellent points. Jamila, thank you so much for joining us. Really excellent points that feed in perfectly to the next section. There are very few areas in pharmaceuticals that are this open in terms of what's actually being prescribed. There's definitely a trend at the moment that you see in the adult use market in the States, and to a degree, even in the medical market, particularly in Germany, to pursue cannabis flower with higher and higher levels of THC. Cannabis, however, is a very diverse plant. And as we've discussed, it contains a number of different cannabinoids. So just like the legacy market has helped us by educating us, is it possibly hindering the medical market by this overt focus on THC? Because cannabis is a very diverse plant after all. What are your thoughts about that in relation to cannabis genetics and where you see cannabis genetics developing?
Yeah, so first of all, I would say that, everybody forgets that hemp is a man-made fabrication of a subgroup of cannabis, right? So in that side of things, that's just used in the term industrial hemp for the sake of splitting hairs, right? But all that kind of fiber and grain and foodstuffs and materials and construction, all that side of it, right? That's one breeding arm. But we're talking about specifically about the kind of drug type, right? The THC-driven side, as you say. This is the only chemical we knew for a while that was of value in the plant, and that's what's been the driver behind potency, as far as we can tell, for the longest time. And what's happened over a bunch of years is all these legacy breeders have done amazing work in twisting the screw on a fairly limited amount of genetic diversity and driving it in different directions, which has given us a massive array of terpenes and different ratios of aromas and various different levels of potency as well. And not to mention archetypes of plants, in terms of color, structure, all sorts of diversity. But it's still only scratched the surface really on the cannabis genome. It's not really, we've not had the proper explosion of diversity that many of the other crops and more farm plants have had, which have then been driven into the homozygosity for reproduction, stabilization, standardization. We are decades behind in the breeding front in that respect on cannabis. But yeah, that great work that's been done in the legacy market is also been detrimental because it's mostly been driven by potency, smell, and visuals, which are not the most common things to look at when you're breeding plants, right? So, but now we're at an exciting time. We're now seeing the start of the explosion where we have CBG varieties, THCV dominant varieties, and all these wonderful minor cannabinoid dominant varieties. This is starting to go, but we're still working with a very, very small subset of starting material. And I think we need to go back to source genetics and phenohunt more from there, because you know, each one of us in this call could take a team of people into one wild field. If we spent 2 years on it, we'd all come out with something different if we wanted. And that's crop steering as well. You can drive it in certain ways. So I would actually say we're really in the infancy of cannabis breeding now, especially for commercial applications, for medical applications, where we need, like, so I did a degree in genetics. I did a PhD in plant science. I've studied yeast and rice, wheat. I've published on all these things, Arabidopsis especially, algae, and cannabis, for me, other than humans, seems to be one of the most reactive species to its environment, which is why we get this massive amount of variation. So this is something, could we turn this off genetically? Could we reduce that reactivity so that it doesn't vary, so that you get a much more controlled and stable outcome? That seems to me the breeding target for the medical industry, right? Just get the plant really stable, no variation. And obviously the cultivation technique has a massive hand in that as well. But that's where my mind is, right? Where is cannabis breeding in relation? Yeah, we've all came from, you know, well, pulling from the THC world, but now we're just at the start of this new explosion, I think, of diversity. And we've got wonderful researchers around the world really pushing that with all sorts of mutagenesis and molecular breeding techniques. And this is really the next wave of cannabis breeding. The first inception of cannabis breeding proper is going to be so rich with various techniques applied to it, like it will be hard to keep track. It's already hard to keep track, but it will be harder to keep track moving forward as these groups diversify their goals.
Yeah. Mark, do you think that tissue culture plays a fundamental role? And maybe I'm asking the wrong person here, but do you think it plays a fundamental role in kind of setting up this next wave of kind of evolution of cannabis genetics and standardizing them?
If we paint that against the backdrop of other agricultural sectors, you'll find that cannabis will naturally migrate to a platform using tissue culture as starting material. And there are a whole host of reasons why. It's got to do with genetic fidelity, genetic uniformity, the fact that you can guarantee a virus and disease-free crop. There are many, many benefits to doing.
And tissue culture is growing from cells, is that correct? Grafted cells?
Yeah, so basically what you would do, you would take the apical meristem, the top of the cannabis plant, which is the newest growth, and then you would multiply that until you have an unlimited amount of plants. So from that one small subsection of cells, you could end up with millions of plants. But just to rewind 2 minutes ago in the conversation, you were talking about potency. What's really driving it? There's a misnomer that there's an international price set for a gram of cannabis in the pharmaceutical or medical world. But that's not the case. When you sell a gram of cannabis to an off-taker, they're paying for the constituents inside that gram. So if you have a cultivar rather, that is at 15% THC, and you have another one which is at 32% THC, you're going to be getting double the money plus a bit for that potency. So the licensed cultivators are being spurred on by not breed, survival, to create more potent strains. Is that in the patient's best interest? We don't know yet. And from experience, there's some people, you know, hardened adult users that don't specifically like the effect of having medicine that is at 32%. It might be a little bit overwhelming.
Yeah. I mean, Shanna, just a quick question to you, and you know, this may not necessarily be in your wheelhouse, but obviously there is concern about, you know, these very high THC strains, because THC for a small percentage of the population, it's single digits, can have some pretty severe mental health consequences. Do you think that kind of this movement to really high THC strains in the unlicensed space could potentially be negative for for doctors who are prescribing?
Yeah, I think there's two things that I want to say there. One, that the link between conditions such as schizophrenia and high THC cannabis is still very cloudy. Like, we don't really know whether, because, for example, people who may be experiencing symptoms but they don't have a diagnosis yet may experiment with cannabis in the way that the majority of young people do, and may find immense relief from that, and it might be very attractive for them to keep using it. And so it's which thing is preceding which. It may be that the schizophrenic symptoms or the symptoms of mental ill health are the reason why somebody is consuming more cannabis, rather than because they consume cannabis that they're experiencing mental ill health. Because we know that while rates of consumption have increased massively over the last 20 years, and the strength of cannabis has increased massively over the last 20 years, rates of schizophrenia and similar conditions have remained incredibly stable, or have even gone down. First of all, yeah, we need to do a lot more work on that link. But secondly, I do think that there is an over focus on high THC strains. And I think that's because at the moment, it is generally people who are already consuming in this heritage market, or they're self-medicating with cannabis. And in this initial stage, it's often consisting of moving people from that over onto a more regulated framework. But as cannabis prescribing opens up and we get more older people, and we get just a much wider variety of people who wouldn't at the moment consider it, but once it's something that's recommended by their doctor and is treated like any other pharmaceutical, then all of a sudden they'll be open to that. And once we get real diversity among patient populations, I think there'll be a lot more people looking for lower THC formulations, because although it's only a very tiny minority of people who might have extreme adverse events with cannabis, if those even are directly attributable, there are lots and lots of people, probably the majority of people, who could experience discomfort because of the psychoactivity from cannabis. So if they're naive users and they're not used to it and that's not what they're pursuing, then they may not welcome any psychoactivity. So we absolutely need to be looking at lower strength formulations. And earlier somebody mentioned about tolerance and whether we need to increase dosage, and yes, absolutely, I think that prescribers will get to the stage where they're try tighten upwards the percentage of THC that a patient is receiving, or the amount of THC, because it could just be that you're using the same formulation but you're prescribing more of it, so that you can gradually build up someone's tolerance to THC. But we can't see that as a bad thing. Like, people think acquiring tolerance is a bad thing and needs to take tolerance breaks. It can also be seen as a really positive thing, because it can mean that the medicine is being well tolerated, and we want to get people to a point where they are tolerating an amount of THC. Yeah. So
absolutely. Yeah. No, it makes sense. I mean, THC has some pretty impressive medical properties. And you mentioned the causation versus correlation debate there. I think there's some evidence that we know now that with people with schizophrenia and psychosis, high THC cannabis can accelerate onset, and it can impact the length and the severity of the episode. But this is a very small percentage of the population. Nuts are deadly to a small percentage of the population, but we haven't banned them yet.
No,
so,
exactly.
All very good points. Yeah.
I guess that there is some evidence that we need to be careful with, but it's just, I think the amount of attention that very tenuous link with certain psychiatric conditions, I think it's been, it's got an unwarranted amount of attention given the cloudiness of that data and what we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, brilliant. So, I mean, we're moving on to our final section now, which is lighting technology, which is actually really important because it has knock-on effects for the entire product supply chain. So the quality and the intensity of light that the cannabis plant receives has major impacts, not only on its cannabinoid production and the production of minor cannabinoids, but also its terpene profile and therefore its medical properties. What I'd like to do is hand over to you now, John. I know that you believe that in some respects, the way that we measure light and the way that light is being used in cannabis cultivation facilities has perhaps been a little bit two-dimensional, literally and figuratively. So what we'd love to do here is just hear from you for like 3 to 4 minutes on the type of work you're doing, as well as where you think lighting technologies are heading because that obviously has an impact on the entire medical sector. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. First off, anybody that walks through the door and tries to sell you a brown box with a light in it for cannabis, and they tell you that's for a specific job in your facility, they probably don't know much about cannabis or growing plants for that matter. Secondly, anyone tells you it's all about light, they also don't know much, because there are 9 what we call cardinals to growing anything, and they include the usual things we talk about: temperature, humidity, CO2. Those are 3, light's a 4th. Airspeed is also very important, about how you move the gases around the plant, removing CO2, and which produces oxygen. You need to get rid of the oxygen and so forth. So you have to have a whole very holistic view. When we start to look at putting light into what is a multi-million pound facility, we're not thinking about growing inside a 4 foot by 4 foot cannabis tent. And in a 4 by 4 cannabis tent, it's relatively simple to get a lot of light. Cannabis is light hungry, as we all know. It just loves light. Give it as much light as you can, and it will keep growing. However, the question you have to ask yourself is, how is it going to grow? Do you want it tall? Do you want it short? Do you want it broad? How many do you want? Flowers lower down, in the middle, at the top? And again, it will depend whether you're growing a dwarf plant or something that grows very tall. Lots of growers around the world have their own idea of what the right recipe for their crop is going to be. You have to remember that that light recipe will have evolved in conjunction with the other 8 cardinals. That's everything that's going on in the root zone, and the other 4 in the air zone around their particular growing facility. Now, if that's a tent in a loft, it's something in a shed down the road, or it's in a glass house or a polytunnel or a custom built building, that will change. So the most important thing to do, I think certainly we're talking about the professional medicinal cannabis, is stick to something really simple and straightforward, get the energy going and so forth. We have the ability, and we currently produce a product that will enable researchers within those facilities in another room somewhere, where they're not going to cause any major damage to a highly valuable crop by going to do something really daft. But we have a 9-channel tunable system that gives you a commercial level of light that enables you to go away and experiment and find the best things. And as we've heard earlier on, unless you've got all of those things, the origin of the seed, the origin of the plant, the environment in the soil, the nutrient, the air, we can talk about VOCs in the air and so forth. All of those things have to be controlled and measured. So we created a sensor. Instead of being half the size of a mini now, standing on a tripod and taking up far too much space, we've got something about the size of a cricket ball, a baseball for those in America. They're not dissimilar in size. And that's got all 9 cardinals in. And we report all of that data all of the time, 24/7, and we can access it from anywhere in the world. And we can then start to look at when the chemical analyses of the plants come back. We do a lot of that in our own lab, where we break the plant down into its base chemical components, and we can actually see how it's changing, how it's reacting to that environment. Then it goes into AI, and that's where it starts to get really exciting. Because at that point, as that data is flowing in, what we can do is see subtle changes in the plant, subtle changes in its chemical performance and so forth. And we've even got tiny little sensors now, which we can actually push inside the plant, and we can actually look at the chemical reactions and the electrical signals which are moving around inside the plant. And that will tell us if it's happy, if it's not very happy. And we know that when we change a plant from being happy to sad or the other way around, it's not an emotion like ours. It causes some responses. We can see what those changes are. And then as we gather all together, we can start predicting things. So when we see something happen that we don't like, we know what we've got to put on the other side of the balancing scales to correct it.
Well, I think that's us, folks. I mean, it's been a fascinating session. We've covered off everything from like the broader stuff and also sort of, clinical trials to whether the UK is a suitable place to grow, all the way down to the nuts and bolts of lighting. So hopefully we've had something that's appealed to everyone. I just wanted to take a moment to thank you very much, all of you, for joining and contributing. I know that you're exceptionally difficult people. It's one of the reasons why we pre-recorded, because you're all over the world. So trying to pin down all of you at the same time is like sort of, you know, wrestling cats, wild cats covered in oil. So yeah, it's been a fantastic session, and thank you very much. And we look forward to hopefully welcoming you back again next year. Thanks again so much for your time, everyone.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you, everyone.
Great.
Bye.